Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to Loyola University. They've been fantastic hosts over the past few days, and we're really excited to be debating here in New Orleans. In particular, we'd like to thank Dr. Douay for helping us organize this event. They've been really fantastic. So now to introduce debating across borders. The motion in today's debate is going to be ethnic profiling is a just means of combating terrorism. We gave the debaters this motion on Friday morning, and ever since then, they've been preparing. The sides in today's debate were determined through a coin toss. Team 1 won the coin toss, and they chose to argue against the motion. But arguing in favor of the motion is Team 2, consisting of Carlos Felipe Parra Rojas from Colombia, Sam Green from Canada, Crystal Lee from the USA, and lastly, Pierre Garcy from France. Arguing against the motion is Team 1, consisting of Jean Jeplon from Slovenia, Patrick Caldwell from Australia, Hande Öztürk from Turkey, and lastly, Angela Gunn from the USA. Each team will give 3 7-minute speeches, followed by a final 5-minute speech. Throughout these speeches, debaters are going to be asking points of information of the other team. And now, our judges in today's debate round are Daryl Phillips, attorney at the Cochran firm in New Orleans, Tim Lentz, Chief Deputy of St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office, and Steve Beatty, Managing Editor at The Lens, a nonprofit newsroom investigating New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. While the judges will make a final verdict, we're also going to be having an audience vote, and that's going to be unofficial, but we'd like you all to contribute. So basically, after the debate's over, I'm going to ask you all to raise your card, either with the red side or the green side. If you raise your card for the red, that means you're opposing the motion, you're choosing to side with the opposition. And if you raise your card on the green side, that means you're choosing to vote in favor of the motion. You are essentially saying that the proposition won the debate round. After that, we're going to ask the judges what they think and hear the final verdict. So I think that clears up all the details, so let's get started. The first speaker will be Carlos, arguing for the proposition. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have been treating the terrorism day by day, month by month, and it's time to do something now. It's time to go against and fight against the terrorism. Why we came from different countries just for discuss about the topic, about the terrorism? Why is it so important? Why it is different between a murder or a kidnapping? It is important. How the terrorism works. Works by some terrorists making violence act. With those violence acts, they create fear in the population, and with that fear, they create pressure. Okay, those violence acts take the life of the people. That's the first affection. The second one is that fear. No matter where you're coming from, no matter your nationality, no matter your religion, after the September 11 attacks, you will fear the fear of that attacks. And the political system, they are affecting the whole political system. There is difference between a murder and a terrorist attack, because they are really affecting all the values, important values in the society. It's a plural affectation to all those values. And the terrorism, it is important not just because the life it takes, it is important because the life and the political system and the democratic system, because it is creating fear in all the system. So we are proposing the ethnic profiling. What is profiling? Profiling is extrapolating information of something based on some characteristics. Which characteristics are we looking? We are looking for the ethnics. And what are the ethnics? Ethnics are the cultural factor based in the race, the religion, the idiom, the nationality, all those factors that make the ethnicity. But it's not just the race. I want to be clear in this. Nothing. I want to be clear in this. It's not just the race. There are many factors in that we have to take in account. So we're talking about the ethnicity and the profiling of the ethnicity. Ethnicity is related to the terrorist crimes, and we're going to show how the profile of the terrorists could be related to that topic. So we have a problem here: the safety. And we have a cause to that problem. The safety is being affected by the terrorists, and we have to propose a model that it is a real solution to that problem. The model is the ethnic profile. We are proposing a model. First, it is a safe model that it is rule. What means that it is rule? That it is based on real information that the intelligence authorities give to the border authorities. And second, we are giving a safe model that is based on real information that we get from every person. For example, by interviews, by information in the checkpoint. And we have a real effective model. It is a dynamic model. What means that it is a dynamic model? The political circumstances are changing, and they are in constant change. So we have a model that is also changing and changing the profiles of the possible terrorists or criminals. And the last thing, it is, please.
All of that is just an argument for effective security screening. Where is an argument for why someone should be singled out of a line based on how they appear?
We have our model is based that it is effective, and it is because it is effective. It is a just way to combat the terrorism. Okay, we are based our arguments that the terrorists have a specific modus operandi. It's not, as I said, it's not like any other type of crime. They have a specific modus operandi. It's based in a specific kind of person can be a terrorist. For example, it is, for example, the 80% of the crimes being after the September 11 were committed by Islamic extremists. So that means that it is predictable who will be the perpetrator of a terrorist attack. And we're basing that we have limited resources. We can have like all the time checking all the people, all the persons in one flight. We have to check, we have to focus our time on the main persons that could be like the perpetrators of that crime. So if we have limited resources and we have like predictable system of the perpetrators, we can propose a real effective system that can give you a real solution to the safety problem.
Point of information.
Thank you. In conclusion, it is a real effective system that gives us a just solution to the safety problem. And why is effective? Because the perpetrator, we can find who is the perpetrator, and so we can find the perpetrators, we can reduce the number of terrorist attacks. Thank you.
I stand before you today as a firm believer in equality. I stand before you today as a firm believer in democratic values. And I stand before you today as a firm believer that this motion must fall. Our goal today on the opposition isn't to argue that we shouldn't fight terrorism in every way we can. What we want to show you on today's opposition is that ethnic profiling is not the way to go. What we're going to prove today is that ethnic profiling is simply wrong and is not morally just. Secondly, we're going to prove that it simply just doesn't work. And thirdly, we're going to prove that it only perpetuates the problem of status quo. I'll be dealing with the first two issues, and then Patrick is going to come up and talk about the long-term consequences of such a policy. But before we touch upon that, I would just like to deal with the case that was brought up by Carlos, or a lack of their case, if I might add. Now, there's two basic questions that they needed to answer in this debate. Why we need to do something in the first place, and how we want to go about doing it. And I feel like they didn't do a sufficient job in answering those two questions. So let's start with the why. The only thing Carlos basically said, well, terrorism is bad, we need to fight terrorism. Yes, we agree on the opposition. Terrorism is bad, and we should do everything we can in order to fight it. But he never gave us a clear example of why targeting specific races, specific ethnicities is a must in the current status quo. All he did was come up with a fake and wrong statistic about how most of the terrorist attacks after 9/11 were from Islamic terrorist groups. Ladies and gentlemen, that is simply a false fact. A lot of these attacks, a lot of these terrorist actions were simply caused by either Caucasian white males or groups that are do not simply consist of Islamic people. And I'll talk about that more within my arguments. But it is up to today's government to show us a concrete why as to why we need to do something specifically about these races. And when talking about the how, I have to admit their policy, no thank you, is a bit confusing because they sort of don't target the issue as it is, because ethnic profiling, the definition of ethnic profiling, is the targeting of individuals and groups by law enforcement officials on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, or religion. So when they say, well, we'll be based on real information, in real life, what that's going to mean is that when a police officer at the airport sees someone with a scarf or an Arabic hat, they're going to point him out and they're going to come in for official screening. We on side opposition feel that is wrong, and that brings me straight to my first argument, which simply says that ethnical profiling is morally unjust. We are more than the color of our skin. We are more than our religion. We are more than our ethnicity. All of those things don't make you a terrorist. I, as a white Caucasian male from Europe, am just as likely to perform a terrorist act than Hande, who is Muslim and is from Turkey. We believe that you don't become a terrorist just because you're born in Pakistan or just because you're born in Afghanistan. What we believe, no thank you, on side opposition is that Anders Breivik, who killed 93 people in Norway, a white Caucasian male, is just as likely to have done that than someone from Iran. We believe that Ted Kaczynski, who killed so many people as a white Caucasian male, is just as likely to do all the things that terrorists do.
Sir.
Yes.
Wouldn't it be reasonable, after the killing of Osama bin Laden, for airport security to assume that the most likely people to attack America would be Islamic extremists from Al-Qaeda?
No, that's simply racist, to be honest. We feel on side opposition that it's morally unjust to claim that just because we killed Osama bin Laden, that suddenly all the Arabic world, all Islam, all Muslim will suddenly want to attack America. We feel it's just as likely that someone who is Caucasian, someone who is white, would be willing to do that, as in the case of Timothy McVeigh and all the others that came before him and will definitely come after him. So basically, what we're doing with creating ethnic profiling, we're perpetuating the us against them morality. We're basically saying, if you're not a white Caucasian, you're something to be feared. You're something that we have to be afraid of. And that's not something that the opposition today is willing to claim in a democratic society. I believe that I am just as suspicious as Hande to performing a terrorist act. I believe that I am just as suspicious to performing a terrorist act than Carlos. I believe that me being a white Caucasian male does not give me the privilege, does not give me the moral authority to say you as an Arab, you as a Muslim are less worthy than me and less likely to perform a terrorist act. We on side opposition oppose that kind of morality, and we believe that it's something that is not just. Secondly, Even if they somehow manage to convince you in this debate that it is just to discriminate, we say that ethnic profiling doesn't work. You can call a terrorist many things. You can call him extreme. You can call him radical. But one thing you cannot call a terrorist and terrorist group is stupid. What terrorists will do is they'll just adapt. Instead of sending an Arab to the airport, they'll just recruit a white Caucasian male and make him blow up the airplane or whatever. These people can adapt, as shown by the statistics of the Bipartisan Policy Center, where they found out in 2010 that 21% of the 57 Americans that were convicted of Islamic crimes toward the US were actually white Caucasian males. And we see this number arising. Terrorists will adapt, and they will find different ways to cause harm if they want to do so. Ethnic profiling doesn't work, ladies and gentlemen, because it simply goes about it the wrong way. Everyone is a suspect in the eyes of the side opposition. Everyone is a suspect and should be treated equally. Only by treating everyone equally, only by treating everyone as an equal threat, can we be sure that we're doing the best job to not only protect the United States of America, but to protect every country in the world. So at the end of the day, on side opposition, we believe that equality is important. We believe that you are not where you are born. You are not the color of your skin, and you are not your ethnicity as such. And because of all these reasons, we proudly oppose. Thank you.
We just heard that everyone is a suspect and that law enforcement should treat everyone equally in searches. The problem is we don't do that now. And we've never done that in law enforcement. We've never done that in security. The fact of the matter is we profile all the time. We profile for people's age. We profile whether or not someone's bought their ticket 3 days in advance of their flight with cash. We profile based on a variety of factors to figure out which people are more likely to be a threat. The fact of the matter is that we have limited resources and we can't stop everyone. So if we can show you that it's necessary to find circumstances under which we can show that there is a greater likelihood that someone will perform a terrorist action, we think we're justified in winnowing down our search to get that sample. What I'm going to talk to you about today is about the effectiveness of ethnic profiling, and then I'm going to talk about the effect of banning ethnic profiling on law enforcement personnel in airports. So, a lot of their challenge was that ethnic profiling doesn't work. They said there are examples of circumstances where white Caucasian people have been guilty of terrorist actions. That's true. You can look at Anders Breivik, you can look at Timothy McVeigh, but the fact still remains that the majority of people who take these actions come from specific parts of the world because that's where the recruits come from. They come from the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan. They come from Saudi Arabia. They come from places that we know. And we're not saying that we shouldn't search white people. We're not saying that we shouldn't search everyone to some degree. But what we're saying is that ethnicity should be at least one of the factors in assessing whether or not we think someone is a potential risk. I asked on a point of information whether they thought it was reasonable, after the killing of Osama bin Laden, for everyone to assume that it was more likely for us to be faced with a threat from people who are members of al-Qaeda and people who come from the same background that Osama bin Laden came from. And they tried to push this off as saying that everyone was equally likely to behave in this way. But it's simply not the case. And it's simply not backed up by the facts, because the facts indicate, no thank you, that the majority of the cases that law enforcement manages to catch are by a very specific profile in the United States of America. They tend to be, although not always, a very specific group of people. And if we can target them, not all of the time, but most of the time being able to determine who is the greatest threat, then we've done a good job in making the country more secure.
Point of information?
Go ahead.
You just said that we already done profiling on many bases. And how does that work?
Well, the way it works currently is there's a computer system, a database, where various factors are incorporated into assessing whether or not someone who has purchased an airline ticket is likely to be a threat. Whether or not you bought your ticket in a very short time before the flight, whether you paid in cash, whether you've traveled to certain target countries beforehand, all of these factors can constitute a large analysis of all the things that might be relevant. We're not saying that the only thing we're going to look at is someone's race. We're not saying that the only thing we're going to look at is the color of someone's skin. But I would tell you that it is relevant where someone comes from and the background that they have in assessing whether or not they potentially be a threat. And I think any realistic law enforcement officer would agree with me. So let's look at some further arguments for this case. When Mohammed Atta checked in to the airport at Logan in Boston, flying to LA, the agent who checked him in immediately thought, I think this guy might be a threat. But his immediate response in his own head was to say, wait a second, I should be ashamed of that thought. I should be afraid. I shouldn't believe that someone is likely to be a threat based on their ethnicity. And it turns out that he was wrong about that. The fact of the matter is that racial profiling happens in airports as it stands. The problem is there are no rules governing how it's done. Ethnic profiling isn't governed by a system that logically determines which people are more likely at what time to be threats. Right now, ethnic profiling happens as a result of people using their own personal biases to make these decisions. If we use ethnic profile explicitly, as has been done in Israel very effectively, then we can create rules and training so that officers need not be discriminatory. They simply need to match the profile that they've been given at a certain time. And that profile can be adjusted to fit the facts. No, thank you. Furthermore, I would tell you that it's quite possible that, like the agent that checked Mohammed Atta in, the perception that it is discriminatory to use ethnic profiling creates a chilling effect on the capacity of airport security guards to do their jobs well. Because if a security guard believes that when he takes a young Muslim man out of a line and searches him because of a combination of suspicious behavior, a combination of contextual factors, if he believes, that security guard believes, that he is going to be perceived as having taken an action that is racist and discriminatory, then he might feel uncomfortable in taking the action that's necessary to protect the security of the airport. We would tell you that an explicit system of ethnic profiling does a much better job of creating the circumstances where it can be done fairly, when it can be done to the best of advantage of security. So, what did they talk about? They claimed that ethnic profiling doesn't work. Well, I've given you good reason to believe that it does. It works because the statistics back it up. The facts and figures demonstrate that at certain times, in certain places, the right approach is to pick a particular ethnicity and search that ethnicity more often.
Point of information.
It sounds ugly. We understand that. But the fact is that if we don't search the people that we suspect to be the most likely to cause problems, then we have a couple of options. Either we can search everyone at random and be much less likely to catch the perpetrators, or we simply allow these types of threats to go unchecked. So we would say that in a world of limited resources, of limited time, of limited money, that we need to be able to find a profile that fits, that works. So I've told you today that it doesn't sound appropriate to ethnically profile, but it's appropriate because it's necessary. It's appropriate because it's a measure that we need to take to protect civilian lives. Because at the end of the day, terrorism is too dangerous a threat for us to stand idly by and say that our abstract principles are more important than our security. Thank you.
Thank you. They're not abstract principles. They're ideas like due process, like protection from an unequal system of justice and justice unequally administrated. The reason that we think they're important is because we think everyone is equal and should be equal before the law. The reason we codify those into things like constitutions is because we want to protect our worst instincts, protect ourselves from our worst instincts, make sure that our better selves prevail in times when we act out of fear. Because it's when the bells of war toll that we occasionally single people out as the other, as people of whom we should be afraid. I'm going to be talking about what this does to society, about the long-term effects and how it creates a dialogue that can never ever get better because it polarizes that dialogue between those that we would see as being exclusively terrorists and those we would see as being exclusively righteous. Before I do that, I want to deal with two things that we've heard from the affirmative in this debate. First, what are the assumptions that they've given us? And second, this limited resource environment material we just heard from Sam. On the assumptions, the first one was great. It was there's a lot of terrorism, so we have to do something about it, and that something is ethnic profiling. Obviously, we wouldn't argue that terrorism is fine and that we shouldn't do something about it. But you can't just stand up and say, X is a problem, therefore any solution to X must be the solution that we should go with. That leads you down a path that equates in the kinds of programs that Obama thankfully discontinued because they, one, didn't work, and two, meant that America's standing internationally suffered exponentially. Two, this idea that all terrorists are motivated the same way, that it's incredibly likely that if someone wants to get on a plane and do something nasty to that plane, they're probably a Muslim, they're probably from Pakistan. Untrue. The fact of the matter is that 95% of terrorist attacks since September 11, 2001 have not been perpetrated by Muslims. But there are more and more important facts. What we heard from Sam was this idea that, wait a minute, if you're a government and Osama bin Laden has just been killed by commandos in Pakistan, whom do you profile? Well, let's posit that. What if you're the Norwegian government and you've got some kind of gateway into the central area of Norway to make sure that some people get in and some people don't? If you profile the person who looks like they're a Muslim, that is to say, looks like they come from Asia or Pakistan, and let someone who looks like an ethnic white Norwegian through, how does that work out for the 93 people who were killed in a bomb blast and subsequent shooting? It turns out it doesn't. It turns out there are other terrorist threats, as Oklahoma in 1995, as the murder of Tiller in Chicago, or pardon me, I think Atlanta would testify. Muslims are not the only threat, they're not the only terrorists, and to assume so is dangerous. And last, this offensive assumption that all Muslims are motivated the same way, that to be part of this religion is automatically to buy in to the kind of terrorist ideas that an extreme few do. I'm going to deal with that in my substantive matter. Secondly, to turn to this limited resource environment material that we just heard. We heard it's not an ideal world, and we need to deploy our resources as best we can. You're absolutely right. It's not an ideal world, because the world that we had envisioned for us by the affirmative team in this debate is one of some presumably phenomenal supercomputer inputting an enormous amount of data, of which only a small percentage is someone's ethnicity. The reality of this world is when someone stands in a line and looks just a little bit darker than the next person in that line, then they get pulled out for additional screening. It's random decisions made by local law enforcement. And it turns out when you give local law enforcement the power to make those kinds of decisions, they don't apply it equally and across the board. They apply it to single out. They apply it in a discriminatory fashion. When stop and search powers were granted to the British police force in London in the last few years, it turns out that they stopped black young males at a rate 26 to 1 of what they stopped white young males. That doesn't do anything to improve relations between the state and people living within that state, and we don't think it does anything to stop terrorism either. Then we heard what is possibly my favourite argument from the government. It was, well, sure, this policy is bad, but if we regulate it through training, then we've got a necessary evil that is kind of adequately done, and that's going to be good. Two responses to this. One, it is at best sloppy argumentation. So if we change this topic that we should have torture, the argument that torture already happens, it just happens off the books and without IV lines, therefore we should flip this over and make sure that it's done in kind of surgically pristine environments by people with appropriate training in how to exact the maximum amount of pain but keep people alive, it wouldn't fly there because the harm is obviously too profound to contemplate. But second of all, let's say that becomes the explicit policy of the TSA. Let's say we put it on a website, we're going to have ethnic profiling at airports. Terrorists aren't stupid. Just how long do you think it would be before an organisation that conspired to kill almost 3,000 Americans in 2001 would say, you know what we should do? Maybe we should use one of the many white people who subscribe to these same beliefs. We'll send through a couple of people who don't look white. They might get pulled over by airport security. But in the meantime, if we accept that it's a limited resource environment, that necessarily means there will be holes, and that attention is animated by virtue of how people look, that necessarily means that logically, the people who get pulled over are not the people who look like Anders Breivik, they're not the people who look like David Hicks, an Australian citizen who just got released from Guantanamo Bay because they found this white guy from outback New South Wales on the battlefield fighting against the Taliban, like many similar people. To turn to what I'm going to offer you in this debate. The long-term effects of discriminating against individuals and then those individuals aggregated or a group are horrific for society. They do three things. First, they disenfranchise the individual. So the individual feels violated. It's a violation of their personhood and how they look when they're singled out by police and that police officer tells them, you're more likely to blow up this plane of your fellow citizens because of how you look, because of the faith that you might profess. And I know that just from looking at you. Second of all, it disempowers the moderates in that community. So you're less likely to hear from moderate Muslims, and it turns out we really need those people. Of the terrorist attacks since 2001 that have been plotted by homegrown Muslim potential terrorists in the United States, fully 40% of them were thwarted by the FBI based on tips from other Muslims who went to their local mosque and said, I don't like what that guy's planning, we need to stop that. You lose the capacity for moderates to change the debate. And the last thing that happens is you polarize the debate. Because the only people selling a message in the Muslim world are those people sending a message that says, we are victims. You need to take up a sword and defend against this onslaught against Islam. Violence is the only answer. You legitimate that message. When you have, for instance, hearings hosted by a New York congressman on why Islam is the most evil thing facing the United States, despite the fact that in all terrorist attacks since 2001, 33 people have died, rather than murder, for instance, which is a garden variety thing, claimed 150,000 people. It's time to reprioritise the debate. It's time to make sure that the kind of environment we have for social discourse is one in which sensible people can be heard. And by discriminating against people based on something that we would say is a fundamental right of theirs to practice freely and not be singled out in the line, we not only don't solve the problem, we make sure that we never will.
Ladies and gentlemen, the opposition seems to have understood most of the ideas that have come out in today's debate, but they completely misunderstand what it is that needs to be done about them. Because if we further examine their arguments on point, we find that their results closely resemble that of a Shakespearean tragedy. The rhetoric is vibrant and the characters are colorful, but at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, all of the characters end up either dead or insane, because that's the effect of a willfully blind team to a solution that would better address the imminent and very dangerous problem of terrorism. So what am I going to be doing for you today? I'm going to be distilling all of the arguments that have come from both sides of the debate into two major issues. First, I'm going to be talking about it as an issue of principle. Is this something that's morally acceptable for governments to do? And second, I'm going to be talking about it as an issue of practicality. Does this work, and is it going to be useful to decrease terrorism in the future? Now let's come first to this issue of principle, because both sides agree that there is a measurable, distinctive exchange of rights when we implement this policy because it's necessarily more invasive at airport security checkpoints. But we also accept on side proposition the tragic but necessary costs that come with fighting a war. We know that when we drop a bomb, we know with actuarial certainty that there are going to be civilian deaths associated with it. Even the act of entering a war, ladies and gentlemen, acknowledges that some of our men may die defending their country. But ladies and gentlemen, we think that in this case, when it comes to protecting our country, that's a risk we're willing to take. But furthermore, we also argue that race can be used as a consideration in government procedure without discriminating when the basis is rational logic as opposed to irrational bias. Sam talked about this quite a bit in his speech. And we think that this has already been institutionalized. Patrick talks about the Constitution. We think that this type of consideration where race can be used without discriminating has also been standardized within strict scrutiny and judicial review. So we think that on that legal ground, that's quite possible. We think, ladies and gentlemen, this already occurs in law enforcement. When a bank robber's description comes out and says that he's driving a red car, he's Caucasian, and he has black hair, law enforcement officials are going to go out looking for red cars, and they're going to be more likely to stop them when they see that the person that's driving them is Caucasian and has black hair. That's simply not racist, ladies and gentlemen. That's just a rational decision that's being made by rational people. No, thank you. We see that this case is also similar in the case when law enforcement officials are investigating Italian mobsters that are being associated with violent crime. They're going to be more likely to investigate convicted felons who are also Italian, ladies and gentlemen. This isn't racist. This is simply rational logic. Yes.
The reason that your example isn't an example of racism is because they already have a description of someone driving a red car and they try to pull over people who match that description. If, on the other hand, they set up on the road and pulled people over based on the fact that they were driving a red car before anything had happened, that's the kind of distinction that we're talking about here.
Right, but Carlos told you in the first speech that our models isn't going to be a static one. It's going to be a dynamic profile database. It's going to be based on intelligence that we gather from multiple intelligence agencies, ladies and gentlemen. It changes based on the location. We don't think that a Muslim profile would necessarily be useful in Norway, but we do think that it might be useful in the United States, where there is a lot of anti-American sentiment in these extremist organizations. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure this is sort of the argument that we've been hearing on side opposition. No, thank you. Is that, like, these profiles don't always match. If we're talking about Italian mobsters, the person that might actually committed the crime might be the Irish-German Tom Hagen rather than Michael Corleone. But we say that, you know, in this circumstance, race isn't ethnicity, ladies and gentlemen. We told this quite clearly in our first speech. We think that ethnic profiling can be used in tandem with a lot of different factors that Sam talked about, including the frequency of travel, the time of ticket sale, behavioral tics during security checkpoints, ladies and gentlemen. This isn't a singular factor that we're using within these circumstances. So we think that if it were Tom Hagen, the statistical likelihood of catching him is still quite high, because ethnicity isn't the only factor determining airport profiling. But now, let's come to an issue of practicality. Because we concede on side proposition that we're not going to catch them all, but you're going to be damn sure on side proposition that we're going to do everything it is in our power to make sure that terrorists get through as little as possible. Now, we heard a lot on side opposition that this type of ethnic profiling is random, and it doesn't actually it's not actually based on any type of evidence. But we told you already quite clearly on our model, on side proposition, that it's going to be a rule-based system. There's going to be education and training, and it's based on intelligence reports for certain regions. And so we think that this type of system is the type of system that would be based on evidence and rather than conjecture.
Point of information?
Sure.
Are you aware that the definition of ethnic profiling is using someone's race or ethnicity as opposed to suspicious behavior or information?
Yeah, that's fine, but we're not saying that it can't be used in tandem. I'm going to be talking about the practicality issues a little bit more. According to the Investigative Project on Terrorism, 80% or more of the terrorist attacks since 9/11 have been driven by a radical Islamist agenda. We're not saying that it's always going to be Arab, ladies and gentlemen, but we do think that there's a certain type of agenda, there's a certain type of thinking, and John actually told us in his first speech that they subscribe to the same type of beliefs. That's a profile, ladies and gentlemen. Even during 9/11, we saw that 15 out of the 16 bombers came from the Arabian Peninsula. We don't think that this is a coincidence, ladies and gentlemen, because the reason why screening failed that time in screening out these terrorists, and the reason why screening is going to fail in the future, is because it uses factors that are within the terrorist control. If they know that you're looking at people who are buying one-way tickets and don't check bags and have suspicious behaviors, long before they go to the airports, then they're just going to buy a round-trip ticket and check in some bags. Ethnic profile, ladies and gentlemen, on the other hand, is beyond their control. And while we shouldn't And we know that while we shouldn't ignore ethnic profiling altogether, we shouldn't overuse it either. In fact, studies by William Press at the University of Texas, Austin, found that using tactical profiling methods in moderation creates the maximum amount of efficiency within the resource infrastructure that we have, because it's going to be because these terrorists are going to be more likely to be caught at earlier checkpoints. A 30-second delay at an airport checkpoint, ladies and gentlemen, creates a 3-hour delay in your flight. And that's just the reality of our resources. We need to use tactical methods rather than a blanket one in order to create the maximum efficiency. And so in this case, the facts definitely support our intuition. We have no illusions about the problem, ladies and gentlemen, and we have no illusions about the solution. We think it's morally acceptable and effective, and it's a just means for combating terrorism. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we're here because we're discussing whether ethnic profiling is a just means of combating terrorism. And the proposition side wants us to believe that it is just as it is useful, whereas we've just explained to you that it is neither just nor useful. And the only reason they could have justified their proposition would have been if they could prove, matter of fact, that this would work. But unfortunately, they just couldn't show us how it would work. Today, I gather my points at 2 clashes. So basically, first issue was morality issues, and the second point was practicality issues. When we look at the morality, as we've just explained, this is just unjust. They were saying that profiling is different than discriminating, and how it is already in use, and if we just explicitly implement it, then it's going to be just a better system than not explicitly using it. And then we're just saying, okay, you might think that if we explicitly implement ethnic profiling, it's going to be better than not doing explicitly ethnic profiling, whereas we're just saying the best would be not ethnic profile at all. Because, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, they say we've already profiled on many bases. And then they're also saying that a security guard, for example, should care for his country, which is understandable. And then they also say to defend our country, that is a risk that we're willing to take. Well, I have some really bad news for you. If you're gonna just end up saying that ethnic profiling is gonna help us to defend our country, as we said, well, first of all, terrorists are not stupid. They're gonna find their ways through the cracks, and they're gonna blow up the system. They're gonna be there. They might be even here now. You can be terrorist. I can be terrorist. Terrorists don't walk in the alleys just carrying a sign saying that they're terrorists. They know how to disguise. They could do that. It's not a really hard job for them. And when we they say that they made a clear distinction between race and ethnics, whereas we don't really see how they made it, because they really didn't point out how they made a race and ethnical profiling distinction. And they're always saying that, oh, we could use ethnical profiling with tandem to other profiling. Well, we're saying, look, we're not discussing other profiling. We're just saying that we're gonna just assume someone is potential terrorist because that person was born in Indonesia, because that person was born in France, because that person was born in Turkey. No, ladies and gentlemen, terrorist and being terrorist is not in our genes. It's not in our gene pools. No, it's not like having blue eyes, which is coded to your DNA. No, ladies and gentlemen, just because you're born in a country, just because you believe in a religion, doesn't make you a terrorist. I am Turkish. I was born in Turkey, I'm Muslim, and I'm practitioner. That doesn't make it enough to believe that I am suspicious, more suspicious than any other human being here. That doesn't make me suspicious. That doesn't make me want to blow up World Trade Center. That definitely doesn't want to make me do that. And because, ladies and gentlemen, when you ethnically profile people, you look at them and you say, hey, you know, I have a bad feeling about your looks.
Point of information.
And you know it's why? Because you look different than me. And I'm gonna just say that, I'm just gonna assume that you're more threat to me than another person here.
Point of information?
Yeah, come please.
Right, but it's just as delusional to say that the cause of racism or the cause of terrorism is airport screening.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's not delusional. I mean, when you look at that, when you do profiling and when you do ethnical profiling, you assume that it's gonna work. But then you also assume that the threat is always coming from others, which is so easy to profile because they definitely have different hair color, they have different skin color, they're different, so it's easy to target on them. But they could use, as we just showed, they could use people who just look like us. You say that Norwegian example was an extraordinary example and exceptional case, whereas we believe that it can happen even more often in the future if you're going to implement ethnical profiling, because terrorists would know then they should just look like us, which wouldn't be that hard.
Information.
Well, if you were the Norwegian government and if you were to implement ethnical profiling, that's fine. You want to combat against terrorism? Do it. But then you would say, hey, you're in Norway, and you're probably not going to be afraid of Caucasians, would you? I mean, your country is full of white Caucasians, like they're even the whitest people. And then so when you're going to ethnical profile, you're just going to assume that people who are like, well, me, I get really dark during summer, are more threat than, you know, him. Okay, so in this case, no point of information anymore. So in this case, Anders Breivik would just be in a scope which would be considered okay, and that's not a threat to us. And when you deal with the terrorist attacks, you're just assuming that the numbers matter. But the numbers don't matter. I mean, even if you only have one terrorist like Anders Breivik, oh, it can cause a lot of damage. Look at that. He just killed 100 people. He could have killed another 100 people. And another person like Anders Breivik could just kill another 100 people. It just takes a person to kill tons of people. I could have just blown myself up here, even if I don't fall in the scope, which is considered to be not threat to you, let's say. But, I mean, let's assume that I somehow managed to just fall in a scope which is not threat to you. Well, I could have just blow myself up and blow the entire state with me. They have the devices to be able to do that. So even if you have one person in your hand that you cannot control, he's always going to come up and he's always going to be able to cause more damage than you ever think of. And it is very scary that if you ethnically profile, well, you're going to have some people who could fall through the cracks, and then letting them falling through the cracks is actually more dangerous to your system, because then you will be focused more on ethnical issues, and because that's what you're targeting at, and then there are going to be some people who are clean compared to your ethnical profiling, and it's going to be even easier for them to fall through the cracks and blow up the entire state. It could have been Anders Breivik, it could have been Ted Kaczynski, it could have been anyone. Look at Colleen LaRose, who calls herself Jihad Jane. She's white. And then she could have enough people to recruit to cause a lot of damage. So what we're saying today is morally unjust to discriminate, and ethnical profiling is no different than discrimination, and it hurts people. And then secondly, it's not gonna work because terrorists are not stupid.
ladies and gentlemen, the opposition is not opposed to using extensive information and suspicious behavior in order to profile people who might be terrorists. What we're opposed to is defining being Arab as suspicious behavior. So remember, basically, this is the difference between saying, we know we have a suspect who's 5'11", he's 180 pounds, he's African-American, he has a tattoo on his right shoulder and a scar on his shin, and pulling over someone with that description, versus saying, a black man committed a crime today, and then frisking every black man you see. This is a complete distinction. So remember, there are three major arguments that are relevant in this debate. First, there's the issue of morality. Essentially, the proposition is telling you that ethnic profiling is a necessary evil, that we have an exchange of rights in a time of terror. But what we're saying, ladies and gentlemen, I don't need to remind you of the horrors that racial assumptions have inflicted upon the United States in its time of existence. Racially profiling or allowing racial assumptions perpetuates ideas of an us and them ideology, where we say they're untrustworthy because they're different from us. So basically what we're saying is that in the United States we have this value of equality. We want to judge all people on their character as opposed to what they look like. And when you allow for racial profiling, you go against everything that we hold as dear in our society. So remember that you can't vote for them simply because they are not respecting American values. But second of all, remember what my teammates told you about the effectiveness of racial profiling. It's not going to be effective, one, because it's very easily avoided. There are white terrorists who work with al-Qaeda. Colleen LaRose, who called herself Jihad Jane, is a perfect example of this. And the more and more we ethnically profile, the more and more al-Qaeda will simply just use people of other ethnicities. So really, it's a system which is going to fall flat on its own face because it's not going to work. But also remember, ladies and gentlemen, that the proposition keeps telling you, well, we have limited resources. And I agree with them. That's exactly the problem. The problem is that we only have so much money and so many law enforcement officers. And when you waste your time and money looking at people who are not suspicious for any reason except that they are Arab, instead of looking at someone who's suspicious because they bought a one-way flight with cash, or someone who's suspicious because they're espousing racial violence on the internet, then you have the problem of wasting your time and resources on innocent people as opposed to people who are likely to be terrorists. So remember, ladies and gentlemen, the second reason why you're going to vote, why you should support the opposition and oppose ethnic profiling is that it's not going to work because you're not just looking for Arabs, you're not just looking for South Asians, you're looking for anyone that wants to pose a threat to the United States. And remember that it's not even just white people who agree with al-Qaeda. The proposition told you, well, isn't it reasonable that the next major terrorist attack after Osama bin Laden's death would be by a Muslim? Well, they think that's reasonable, but as far as I remember, they were wrong. The next major terrorist attack was in Norway, where Anders Breivik, a white supremacist, killed 76 people. But thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, the reason why you don't want to look to ethnic profiling, because even if you say, fine, it's a necessary evil, even if you agree with them on that point, and even if you think that it's going to work in finding terrorists, well, it's still not going to be effective because, fine, you found 2 terrorists, but you're going to form 10 more because you're destroying the community that you have within the United States. When you constantly racially profile people, you alienate them. We see this within our civilian society, where you have young black men who are alienated from society because they've been frisked 20 or 30 times by police officers who automatically suspect them of crimes simply on the basis of their race. Remember what my teammates told you is that when you racially profile someone, they're not going to feel, when they don't feel like they're part of the community, they might see suspicious behavior, but they won't report it to the authorities because they don't trust the authorities. Why don't they trust the authorities? Because the authorities don't trust them. I don't trust people who don't trust me, and I don't see why anyone else would act any different. But furthermore, you can remember that when people feel shunned, I mean, think about it, ladies and gentlemen. If you don't feel accepted by society, if you don't feel like people consider you an American, if you don't feel like you're really one of this community, terrorists are going to play on that. They tell you, they essentially reach out to these youths saying, well, they don't accept you, they don't think you're American, they don't think you're peaceful, they see you simply by your turban or simply by the clothing you wear. And the youths are, I mean, the fact is young people are malleable, and so when you have this message being reached out to young people in the community, they're more prone to join these terrorist groups. So like I said before, fine, let's say you caught a terrorist by ethnically profiling. Okay, but all the other people that you profiled, now they are possibly going to be more sympathetic to that terrorist actions. So ladies and gentlemen, essentially what this debate comes down to is, are you willing to implement an immoral policy, which is most likely not going to work for all of the reasons that we've already given you. And then, after you've violated your values, and use this ineffective policy, you created an angry and alienated community within your country. If you think that's a good idea, you should vote for the proposition. But if you see that this is sheer madness, I ask you to join us today in opposing this motion. Thank you.
Delightful host, dignified members of the jury, cherished members of the proposition, Looney Tunes clique of an opposition, ladies and gentlemen, lovely Louisiana, good afternoon. A theory is a good theory when it is a beautiful theory, said Raymond Poincaré, or as would be in English, Raymond Square. That's a literal translation. Great scientist, great thinker, probably the greatest genius of all time. And that's not me being a French chauvinist. I'm all the less chauvinist as I'm willing to accept today that the fantastic Mr. Square was actually wrong. Because today, the opposition has proved him wrong. They've managed to come up with a theory that is beautiful, with capital letter words nicely put together, but far from being good. There is one element that you don't seem to have taken into account in your conception of the subject. The world is not a safe place. America is not safe. America has to protect itself, and that changes everything. Your claims don't weigh much when balanced by the threat of terrorism. Let us remember that the situation as it is for America is an all-out war against terrorism, never seen in the past. It is a war against an enemy that is difficult to identify. It is one guy every once in a while that kills thousands. That man has to be found and stopped. And profiling, including ethnic profiling, helps the authorities manage to do that. We do arrest terrorists using profiling. This country finds itself caught up in an incomprehensible war against enemies that have no respect for civilians, no idea of what the morality of warfare is. Let me stress that point. It is an all-out war. And as part of a war effort, a proud and aware people like the American people should be willing to sacrifice a little bit of freedom so that those that are attacking this country can be stopped. The opposition tried to take the high moral ground on us. Ethnic profiling is immoral. Ethnic profiling is not just. Well, let me ask you this. Would you feel it would be just if a government didn't do everything that is in its power to protect its people? Would you feel it would be just if the state, because of weak bigotry, didn't use the means at their disposal to prevent another 9/11? Facing terrorism, the most immoral enemy a country can have, you have to adjust to the situation. Let me take an example. If another attack took place, another 9/11, killing thousands, with Al-Qaeda responsible again, and if the perpetrators could have been stopped using ethnic profiling, if they had been checked and searched and prevented, because the ethnic factor in the database would have cranked their note just a tiny notch and put them in the category of risky people, this country would be in shock, unable to understand why we didn't use ethnic profiling in the first place. Because let's face the fact, and be realistic for a second, all the hijackers of 9/11 were of the same ethnicity. The overwhelming majority of Al-Qaeda members are of the same ethnicity. And since we're looking for common traits among terrorists to identify them, ethnicity should be a profiling factor. Having the feeling that you were picked up to be searched because of your ethnicity sure is an unpleasant and probably humiliating experience. But what are the few hours you're going to spend being interrogated compared with the importance of the issue? Anyone that likes this country should understand that it can happen, that they are to comply with those rules because national security is simply more important than you going through checkpoints in 5 minutes to catch your connecting flight to New Orleans and party Louisiana style. What we're saying, ladies and gentlemen, is that sometimes, in circumstances as dreadful and impossible to deal with as terrorism, measures simply must be taken however unpleasant they are. Ethnic profiling is an efficient way to combat terrorism. It is also a just way to combat terrorism. Please support the motion.
So we just heard a really interesting debate, and now it's time for the audience vote. If you'd like to vote for the proposition sitting on my right, make sure to raise your card on the green side. If you'd like to vote for the opposition, try to raise it on the reddish-orange side. Thanks. Now everyone raise their cards. It looks like it's about evenly split. So now we're going to go to the judges. We're going to leave the judges 10 minutes to deliberate, then call people back. So take your time. Thank you. So it was definitely a tough decision, but the judges have finally made up their minds, so I'd like to welcome them to the stage and thank them for coming here.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank both teams. I thought this was a very compelling and interesting debate. It's my first experience doing something like this, and I'm just blown away and impressed by the quality of the debate, and the level of elocution was very impressive. I looked at this from the two definitions and points of analysis that were presented to us effectively by both sides. Is it a moral issue? Certainly, when the proponents suggested flat out use the phrase that Americans should give up rights, that's something that makes most people, I think, very uncomfortable. And I thought that the opposition answered fairly well, saying that due process is not an abstract thought. The weight of whether it's morally correct, though, has to be, in my opinion, balanced against the effectiveness. It was brought up only toward the end with clarity from the proponents that this is an unsafe country, an unsafe world that we live in, and I have to give some weight, some greater weight to the effectiveness of this, of racial profiling. Very clearly, the opposition said terrorists are not stupid and will adjust rapidly, and I think the proponents clearly stated that your racial profile is one thing that you can adjust and you can't change. Another point that I thought was brought up immediately by the proponents was that it's a dynamic system, and was mentioned that in nowhere does it say that white people won't be profiled, and it could be someone from the backwoods of the country at some point that gets profiled. We'll wrap up with my decision. My vote is with the proponents.
Good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank you for hosting an event. I thought it was very well presented from both sides. It's a pleasure sitting here and watching the work that went into it, and I was very impressed with both sides. The way I analyzed the argument was that I thought there were really 3 key points that were made by both sides. The first point that I think was what I call the moral argument, or the necessary evil argument, in that we're living in very tough times. There's a lot of difficulty in addressing this particular problem. And I thought that the proponents did a very good and persuasive job of convincing me that profiling could be a necessary evil. The second point was, as I describe it, the effectiveness of it. Will it work? What will be the end result? And I think Team 1, or the opposition, did a very, very persuasive job, at least in my opinion, on the ineffectiveness of racial profiling in itself. So finally, in order to make a decision, what I did was the third point was the end result argument. What would happen? What would be the end result if we went to such a program? And I think I was most convinced by the argument that we would steer away the moderates in different cultures if we went to a racial profiling. And based on those 3 points, I found that the opposition to racial profiling was more persuasive, at least in my opinion, and I gave the vote or the nod to the opposition. Thank you.
First off, much like it had already been said, thank you for the opportunity of being here today. This was an absolute blast. And first off, congratulations also to both teams for putting together some very compelling and passionate arguments about this very, at times, controversial topic. I must admit I had some difficulty setting aside my own personal biases, but I came to my conclusion with that, having picked up on some highlights of both of your speeches today. One of the things the fourth side mentioned was the fear. We always live in this constant fear, and how terrorism sometimes can be predictable. Anything that you know about risk management, if it's predictable, it's preventable. So how do you go about making that prediction and trying to prevent it in the future? We profile people all the time was one of your topics, and you're absolutely correct. And of course, the world is not a safe place. And the against side brought up topics such as equality and morally unjust, and terrorism is not in our genes, and racial profiling hurts that individual, and all that is true. But after much consideration, the team that I believe gave the most compelling argument, and I cast my vote for the opposition. Congratulations.
So congratulations to both teams for what was definitely a fantastic debate. Now we'd like to present the opposition with awards. Congratulations. Again, I'd just like to thank both teams for debating, thank everyone for coming, and thank Loyola University for having us. It was great having you all.